Hi, this is the Romantic Period, Part 5 for our Honors Music Appreciation class. We're entering one of my most favorite periods of time, the Romantic Period. Unlike classicism, Romanticism was a worldwide movement, hugely important in really every country in the world, and it occurred in all the arts and literature. Really, first in literature and then gradually took root in music and extended really into the early 20th century, actually. Be sure not to confuse Romanticism with the idea of romantic. Romanticism was a movement in arts and literature and ways of thinking about the world that was much broader than what we think of as romantic, which is kind of that relationship, sexual relationship between two people. Romanticism accounts for that, of course, and human passion and so on, but it's so much more. It's a reaction against the formal balance of classicism, as you can easily see, and it was influenced by the revolutions and the wars that were going on, the social upheaval, the wildly impactful spread of the Industrial Revolution and the effect on the average person's life, and the sense of, reason doesn't really account for everything that seems to be going on around me. Characteristics of Romanticism: a great emphasis on emotion, subjectivity, kind of what the individual person, what I think, how I feel. That whole idea of Wordsworth, spontaneous overflow, Walt Whitman, I celebrate myself, those kinds of values were very important in Romanticism. And the idea of imagination, the subconscious, the role of that which is not rational in our lives, fantasy, all that's irrational, and even as the Romantic period went along, delving into the deep reaches of the dark side of life, of the subconscious and things which are really kind of dark and difficult. The idea of individuality, this went to the idea of superstars. The 19th century was kind of the beginning of that whole notion. We still have it today, say, in sports and in popular music. Rebellion against the age of reason, a sense that the age of reason didn't give enough explanation for how things work in the life that we live. There was an attraction to the exotic, by which I mean all those aspects of cultures that may be completely separate from our own. A return to the Middle Ages in a very romanticized way, and an exaltation of nature, which had not really been so much a part of the classical period. In music, we see these elements reflected in individuality of style. The idea that particular composers had their own unique voice, that they weren't trying so much to develop a form, an abstracted form, but that they were composing music that came from themselves in their own unique way. Expressive ideas and subjects became sufficient as the basis for music. National styles of writing music and exploring the use and incorporation of national and folk elements into music. Exoticism, the importation of elements of music from other cultures that would have been unthinkable in the classical period, began to be used here. Program music, which we first encountered in the Baroque period, was really important as an element of the 19th century. This is instrumental music that is written in order to illustrate a story that the composer has provided. And we see program music at work in Robert Schumann's piano pieces, as well as the huge orchestral works of Berlioz. We'll see that in the musical examples we look at this unit. Expressive tone color and the development of instruments, the wide range of colors, were really valued. Colorful harmony, harmonies used next to each other that would have been unthinkable in the classical period. And the expanded range of dynamics, pitch, tempo, extremes of all kinds, and in form, the use of miniature forms as well as these huge monumental forms. Beethoven was an incredibly important figure to the Romantic composers. He really was the inspiration. He was the example of the lonely genius and someone with real freedom. He was someone who really didn't do his creative work in response to a patron necessarily, although he did take commissions. But he really composed what he wanted to compose. He did not by and large, work for particular institutions either. And he was never a servant musician. He lived about a generation after that, was a typical style for musicians. He extended the boundaries of the classical forms, and in particular, we saw how he really did unusual things, innovative things with sonata form in the Fifth Symphony. He extended the boundaries of expressiveness. He was able to do things with themes that were unthinkable before he wrote Fifth Symphony, stuck in that oboe cadenza where it really sort of didn't belong in the recapitulation section. And then his own life, struggles with deafness, that kind of heroic struggle to fulfill his own destiny as a creative artist, despite the fact that he couldn't even hear his own music. These were all inspirational elements of Beethoven. Romantic performers, all of a sudden, were in the age of virtuosity, and part of this is because people could actually move around Europe and across the Atlantic so much more easily than ever before, and even into other parts of the world. There were technical improvements in the piano, which became technologically the instrument we have today during the early to mid-Romantic period. And lots of other instruments were improved with new valves and metal structures and so on. And finally, middle class and working class people had a shot at becoming one of these virtuosos for the first time in history. They could become composers and performers if they had enough talent and were able to get the training. I'm going to quickly run through the major composers that we'll be looking at in this unit. Virtually, really all of these composers come from middle class kinds of background. Franz Schubert was an early figure, born in Vienna, so he knew the great classical composers, Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn. Made his living mainly through publishing his compositions and not through other means. He was a brilliant child as a composer and actually wrote Erlkönig, the song we're going to be studying, when he was 18 years old, so your age or maybe even a little younger. Wrote the song kind of shattering all the typical forms for songwriting. The poem is a very strict strophic poem written with a very particular rhyme scheme, written by Goethe, one of the great German poets. But at 18, this upstart young fellow writes this musical setting we call through composed. He wrote music that was new. Every phrase of text had new music. He didn't really repeat sections and so on. And so this was really shocking for the time, but dramatically, I think, very effective. And used the piano in idiosyncratic ways to set the psychological scene. Robert Schumann, a very famous composer of the early Romantic period, wrote primarily for the piano and wrote songs, but also some larger works as well. He excelled in this miniature form, kind of short pieces for piano with very evocative kinds of themes. Program music, he left evidence of what he really meant each of those little pieces to represent. Fell in love with the daughter of his piano teacher, Clara Wieck, who actually excelled him in her piano virtuosity and was a concert pianist all her life. These two were kind of the love couple of the 19th century, known by many intellectuals in Europe. Frédéric Chopin, very different kind of figure, a fragile genius, introverted, sensitive, and really composed virtually exclusively for his instrument, the piano. Was a famous performer himself and really created new genres, including the nocturne or night piece, and wrote in a particular style that really became imitated by many composers after him. Hector Berlioz, a French composer, son of a physician, studied at the Paris Conservatory, won the Prix de Rome, so in these ways really was a very conventional, successful young composer. He created kind of this whole world in his mind around Harriet Smithson, Shakespearean actress. He wrote the Symphonie Fantastique for her, and the Symphonie Fantastique was probably one of the great examples of program music in the 19th century. Was kind of written around the story of a figure who, like Berlioz, was obsessed with his ideal woman. Berlioz used an idée fixe, or kind of an obsessive theme that recurs all through that symphony that represents the beloved figure. Johannes Brahms, a very different figure, but again from the middle class, son of a musician in Hamburg, so he comes from the north of Germany. He was a lifelong friend of Robert and Clara Schumann, and in fact, after Robert's untimely death, remained the closest of friends with Clara. Not a sexual relationship, but deeply spiritual, and he passed away not too many more months after Clara died herself. Brahms was a very conservative individual, led a very conventional lifestyle, was shy but kind of a gruff personality. But he really clung to the classical forms, surprisingly, writing them with new romantic kind of language. Absolutely stunningly beautiful lyrical melodies. Listen to the pop song that's linked to this part of our course on our Moodle site, because we can see what pop musicians today have done with music that Brahms wrote in the Romantic period. Finally, we have the figure of Giacomo Puccini, a very famous opera composer in the late Romantic period, Italian. Came from a family of composers and church musicians, and actually kind of struck it rich as a young person, diving into opera and becoming wildly successful. He was part of the Verismo, or realism, school of opera composition, using themes of ordinary working class people, flawed people, people whose lives kind of grab us emotionally. The female lead figures are usually fragile, tragic. Often they die before the end of the opera. And his gift was for soaring melody, melody that's easily remembered, and kind of this continuous outpouring of melody where recitative is almost like aria. I think you'll enjoy that operatic excerpt. So to sum it up, this period was not so long ago. My grandparents' grandparents lived at the time that these composers lived. So the effect of these composers in this culture and these philosophies lives on today. Lots of travel, more than we would expect in the 19th century. Surprising amount of exchange, people coming and going across the Atlantic. And then romantic music being some of the most accessible to people who've never had a taste of classical music. Very tuneful, very individualistic, very expressive. We love that. So enjoy this period, and I hope you love it as much as I do.